Every generation has a story about someone who seemed larger than life. Someone gifted, chosen, different from the start. This is one of those stories. But it's not really about strength. It's about what happens when a person forgets where their strength comes from. This is the story of Samson. Samson's story begins before he ever takes a breath. For 40 long years the Philistines ruled over the land. They controlled cities, roads, and daily life. Fear was common. Hope was quiet. The people of Israel lived knowing they were no longer free. In the small town of Zorah from the tribe of Dan, lived a man named Manoah and his wife. They carried a private sorrow. Though they longed for a child, none came. Year after year passed and their home remained silent. Then one day, without warning, everything changed. The angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife and spoke words that would reshape history. "You are barren and have no children," the angel said, "but you will conceive and give birth to a son." The message came with instructions, clear and serious. She was not to drink wine or any fermented drink. She was not to eat anything unclean. From the moment the child was conceived, he would belong to God. He would be a Nazirite, set apart for a purpose, and no razor was ever to touch his head. "This boy," the angel said, "will begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines." Shaken and overwhelmed, Manoah's wife ran home and told her husband everything she had seen and heard. Manoah listened carefully. Then he prayed. He asked God to send the angel again so they could understand how to raise this child properly. God answered. The angel returned, and Manoah asked the question every parent asks in one form or another: how are we to raise this child? What is his way of life meant to be? The angel repeated the instructions exactly. Nothing was to be changed. Nothing was to be taken lightly. In time, Manoah's wife gave birth to a son. They named him Samson. As the boy grew, it became clear that the blessing of the Lord rested on him. Even before anyone could explain it, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir within him. Samson was different. Not just strong, but unusually so. When Samson became a young man, he traveled down to Timnah, a Philistine town. There he saw a woman, a Philistine woman, and something about her captured his attention. When he returned home, he told his parents plainly, "I saw a Philistine woman in Timnah. Get her for me as my wife." His parents were troubled. "Isn't there a woman among our own people?" they asked. "Must you go to the Philistines?" But Samson would not listen. What his parents did not know, and what Samson himself barely understood, was that God was already at work, even through his stubbornness. Yet this moment revealed something important. Samson's strength was growing faster than his wisdom. He had been chosen. He had been blessed. But he was beginning to walk a dangerous line, one where confidence could slowly turn into carelessness. And this was only the beginning. Samson insisted on the marriage, and despite their concerns, his parents went with him to Timnah. On the way, something unexpected happened. As they passed through a vineyard, a young lion suddenly rushed toward Samson, fierce and fast. There was no weapon in his hand, no warning, no time to think. Yet the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and Samson tore the lion apart with his bare hands as easily as one might tear a young goat. He told no one what had happened, not his parents, not a soul. The moment passed, but the silence remained. Later, when Samson returned to Timnah for the wedding, he turned aside to look at the place where the lion had fallen. To his surprise, bees had made a hive inside the carcass and honey filled it. Samson scooped some out and ate as he walked along. When he reached his parents, he gave them some to eat as well, without explaining where it came from. It was a small secret, but it wouldn't be the last. The wedding feast was arranged as was custom, lasting 7 days. 30 Philistine men were chosen to attend Samson, meant to be companions but likely assigned to watch him closely. Samson, always confident, decided to entertain them with a riddle. "Let me tell you a riddle," he said. "If you can solve it within the 7 days of the feast, I'll give you 30 fine garments. But if you can't, you must give me 30. They agreed. Samson spoke. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. For 3 days they could not solve it. Frustration grew. By the 4th day the Philistine men turned to Samson's wife. They pressured her, threatening her and her family. "Coax the answer out of him," they said, "or we will burn you and your father's house." She wept before Samson. At first he resisted. "I haven't even told my parents," he said. But day after day she pressed him. Her tears wore him down. Finally he told her the answer. She told them. On the 7th day, just before sunset, the men came to Samson with the solution. "What is sweeter than honey?" they said. "What is stronger than a lion?" Samson knew immediately what had happened. His joy vanished, replaced by anger. "If you had not plowed with my heifer," he said, "you would not have solved my riddle." The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him again. Samson went down to Ashkelon, struck down 30 Philistine men, took their garments and gave them to the men who had solved the riddle. Burning with rage, he returned to his father's house. But the damage was done. Samson's wife was given to another man. This betrayal lit a fire in Samson that would not go out quietly. Later, when Samson returned to visit his wife with a young goat, he was told he could not see her. Enraged, Samson decided the Philistines would pay. He caught 300 foxes, tied torches to their tails, and released them into the Philistine fields. Crops burned. Vineyards were destroyed. Olive groves went up in flames. The Philistines demanded to know who had done this. When they learned it was Samson, they turned their anger on his wife and her family, burning them alive. Samson responded with violence of his own, striking many of them down. Afterward, he withdrew and stayed in a cave near the rock of Etam. The Philistines were not done. They marched into Judah and demanded Samson be handed over. Fear spread among the Israelites. 3,000 men from Judah went to the cave and spoke to Samson. "Don't you realize the Philistines rule over us?" they said. "What have you done?" Samson agreed to be bound, but only if they promised not to kill him themselves. They tied him with new ropes and brought him to the Philistines. As the Philistines shouted in triumph, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson once more. The ropes fell from his arms like burnt thread. He saw the jawbone of a donkey on the ground, picked it up, and struck down 1,000 men with it. After the battle, Samson was exhausted and thirsty. For the first time, he cried out to God, acknowledging that the victory had not come from himself. God answered by providing water, and Samson revived. Years passed. Samson judged Israel for 20 years. He was feared, respected, and still dangerously confident. His strength remained, and so did his weakness for risky relationships. One night, Samson went to Gaza and spent time with a woman there. The Philistines surrounded the place, planning to kill him at dawn. But at midnight, Samson rose, tore the city gates from their hinges, and carried them to the top of a hill facing Hebron. Once again he escaped. Once again he believed he always would. Then Samson met Delilah. She lived in the valley of Sorek, and unlike the others, she didn't chase him with fear or force. She watched him, listened to him, asked questions. The Philistine rulers approached her quietly. They offered her silver beyond counting if she could discover the secret of Samson's strength and help them subdue him. Delilah agreed. She began gently. "Tell me," she said, "what makes you so strong? How could someone overpower you?" Samson lied. He gave her false answers, and each time she tested them. Each time he escaped. Each time she accused him of not loving her, of mocking her trust. Day after day she pressed him. Her words weighed on him. The man who had broken ropes and gates began to crack under quiet persistence. Finally, worn down, Samson told her the truth. "No razor has ever touched my head," he said. "If my hair is cut, my strength will leave me, and I will become like any other man." Delilah knew this time was different. That night, as Samson slept with his head on her lap, she called for a man to shave off the 7 locks of his hair. His strength left him, though he did not yet realize it. When she cried out, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson," he woke as before, expecting power, expecting escape. But this time nothing happened. And for the first time in his life, Samson learned what it felt like to be truly helpless. Samson woke to a world that felt suddenly small. The mighty man who had lifted gates, torn lions, and defeated armies now lay bound and powerless. The Philistines had captured him. His hair, the source of his strength, was gone. And with it, the sense of invincibility that had defined him for so long. The Philistines took him away from Delilah's house and brought him to Gaza. There, they humiliated him. They bound him in bronze chains and placed him in a prison, guarded carefully. Once a warrior who had moved fearlessly across the land, he now sat in darkness. Days stretched into weeks. Weeks into months. Years passed. Every day, the clatter of iron chains and the murmurs of his captors reminded Samson of a truth he had ignored. Strength is nothing without wisdom and humility. And though he had survived every battle before, this time, there was no escape, no sudden burst of power, no spirit rushing through him to break ropes and shatter gates. The Philistines, curious and mocking, would often parade him before the crowds. Children pointed and grown men jeered. "Is this the great Samson?" they would ask. "The man who tore lions apart with his bare hands? The one who defeated so many of us?" Samson did not answer. He could not. He could only sit, silent, humiliated, and alone. For the first time he saw what the world looked like from the side of weakness, not triumph. Time in captivity had a strange effect. At first his thoughts were bitter. How could someone so strong, so fearless, be reduced to this? He replayed every choice, every moment of pride and carelessness, and the memory of Delilah's persistence haunted him. He realized that his fall had not come from a lack of strength but from misplaced trust and ignored warnings. The chains were heavy, but heavier still was the weight on his spirit. He had always believed that being chosen meant he was untouchable. Yet here, stripped of everything he relied on, muscle, speed, and power, he faced the truth he had long avoided. He was not invincible. As he sat in the prison, Samson reflected on the years of battles, victories, and reckless decisions. He remembered the lion, the foxes, and the jawbone of a donkey. Each victory had fed a confidence that was not rooted in God but in himself. The same confidence that had once carried him through impossible feats had now led him to captivity. The Philistines celebrated, believing their victory complete. Every festival, every offering to their gods included Samson. They laughed at him, believing him broken. But within the man who had been stripped of strength, something quietly stirred, a mixture of regret, longing, and hope. Years passed and Samson's hair began to grow slowly. Each strand was a reminder of what he had lost, but also of what could be regained. The realization came that his gifts had never truly been his own. They had been entrusted to him, and he had squandered them through pride and distraction. Now, as the locks of hair lengthened again, he felt the stirrings of a power he could no longer take for granted. Every day in prison he prayed, not for revenge, not for escape, but for clarity. Not in grand words or speeches, but quietly, deeply, asking for the courage to face what had come and what might still come. His heart, humbled, began to understand the responsibility that came with strength. The Philistines, unaware of this inner change, continued to parade him in their temples. He was displayed like a trophy, a cautionary tale of a man who had once been unstoppable. He was forced to grind grain, the work of the lowliest slaves, while crowds mocked him from above. Yet in that forced labor Samson found a strange rhythm. Each motion, each repetition became a meditation. Each turn of the millstone reminded him of his limitations, yes, but also of resilience. He was learning patience, the kind no battlefield could teach. And he was learning reflection, the kind no victory could inspire. Delilah's betrayal had cut deep, but Samson now understood the depth of his own mistakes. Trust, he realized, is a gift, not a tool to be toyed with. Strength without humility is a dangerous companion. And power, no matter how great, is meaningless when disconnected from purpose. The Philistines continued their festivals, each more extravagant than the last. Statues were erected in their temples, songs were sung of victories over Israel, and Samson's name was included as a symbol of their supremacy. They laughed, danced, and feasted, never guessing that the man they humiliated was quietly preparing for what no one could see coming. In the quiet of his cell, Samson began to see a path forward. He would not rely on anger or pride as he had before. He would not trust the fleeting loyalty of those around him. And he would not chase glory for himself. Instead, he focused on understanding the gift he had wasted, the strength he had misused, and the life he had been given. The chains that bound him, once symbols of shame, became reminders of a deeper truth. True power is not measured by feats or fear, but by the courage to recognize one's weaknesses and learn from them. Samson's captivity, though harsh and humiliating, became the crucible in which patience, wisdom, and purpose were forged. And then one morning, as the sun rose over the valley of Sorek, Samson realized that the final test was approaching. His hair had grown long again, and with it, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir within him once more. He would not rise in recklessness or pride this time. He would rise with purpose, clarity, and a heart transformed by reflection. But first he had to wait. Wait for the moment when he could act not as a man seeking revenge, but as a man reclaiming his calling. Wait for the chance to demonstrate that true strength was not measured by what he could destroy, but by what he could endure, learn from, and ultimately give back. The Philistines, confident in their victory, continued to celebrate, unaware that the man they had humiliated was no longer the same Samson who had fallen into their hands. Their mockery, their feasts, their festivals, all of it would soon serve as the stage for a lesson they could not anticipate. In the darkness of captivity, Samson understood something he had never grasped in the brightness of victory. Strength alone is fleeting. Humility and purpose are eternal. And even a man brought low can rise again, not by force, but by recognizing his dependence on something far greater than himself. Samson's story was far from over. The boy who had once torn lions apart with his hands, the man who had fought enemies and mockers alike, was now poised at the edge of something greater. The next act would not be for glory, not for pride, but for redemption. A moment that would test not just his strength but his heart, his choices, and his understanding of what it truly meant to be chosen. And so, as the Philistines celebrated above, Samson sat quietly below, chains heavy on his wrists, but a quiet determination growing within. The Spirit of the Lord whispered again, and Samson listened, no longer reckless, no longer proud, but ready. The greatest act of his life had yet to come. Samson sat in the dark, the chains heavy on his wrists, but the Spirit of the Lord had returned to him. His hair had grown long again, each strand a reminder that gifts are not permanent unless treated with care. He had spent years in this prison, stripped of pride, stripped of power, stripped of freedom. And yet, in the quiet and the stillness, Samson had found something stronger than his muscles. Understanding. He understood now what strength really meant. It wasn't the jawbone of a donkey or the tearing of a lion. It wasn't burning fields or striking down enemies. True strength was measured in endurance, in patience, in knowing your limitations, and still standing to do what must be done. The Philistines, however, did not see the change. They only saw their captive, the man they had humiliated and chained. Their temples were filled with celebration. Their idols seemed to tower higher, and their people laughed and danced, believing they had nothing to fear. On one particular day, the rulers of the Philistines called for a great festival, a tribute to their gods. They brought Samson out from the prison to entertain them, a spectacle of mockery. He was placed between the temple pillars, bound in chains, facing the crowd of thousands. Children laughed, elders shook their heads, and the priests of Dagon whispered to each other about how the mighty Samson had fallen. For a moment, Samson could feel the old frustration rising. He could think of every wrong, every betrayal, every careless choice that had brought him here. But he did not act in anger. He did not act in pride. He acted in purpose. "Let me rest," he said quietly to the young man guiding him. "Lean on the pillars of the temple. Hold me steady." The men did as he asked, laughing softly at what they thought was weakness. Then Samson prayed. Not in grand words, not in the voice of a warrior seeking revenge, but in a quiet, desperate whisper. "Lord," he said, "remember me. Strengthen me once more, only this time for your purpose." He felt the Spirit come upon him like a river breaking through a dam. It was not the same reckless energy of youth. It was focused, deliberate, and unstoppable. Samson placed his hands on the two central pillars supporting the temple's roof. The weight pressed down on him, the chains dug into his wrists, but his resolve was unshakable. He exhaled, gathering all the courage and all the strength he had left. And then he pushed. The pillars groaned under the pressure. Dust fell from the roof. The people laughed, until the first cracks appeared. Then, with one final, terrible effort, the temple began to collapse. Stone and timber fell in a thunderous crash. The crowd screamed. Chaos erupted. Samson's arms trembled with exertion, his muscles straining as if every ounce of his life was being poured into this one act. The temple crumbled around him. The Philistines who had mocked him, who had humiliated him, who had built their triumph on his capture, they were gone. Samson had struck down thousands in one decisive act. But this was not vanity. This was not revenge. This was purpose. In that moment, Samson fell with the temple, and the Spirit of the Lord departed with him. He died, yes, but his death carried a meaning that victory alone could never achieve. The man who had been chosen, the man who had been flawed, had finally aligned his strength with his purpose. The Israelites who survived were stunned. They buried Samson in the tomb of his father Manoah, a grave marked not by shame but by honor. They remembered not only his mighty deeds but also the lessons his life carried. That strength without wisdom is dangerous, that pride can blind even the chosen, and that redemption is always possible if one turns back with humility and purpose. Samson's story did not end with the temple's collapse. His name lived on. Stories were told from generation to generation about the boy who had torn a lion apart, the man who had destroyed armies with a jawbone, and the hero who had brought down the Philistines, not for glory, not for fame, but for a higher calling. It was a story that reminded people that gifts are a responsibility, that every blessing carries a weight, and that even those who fall can rise again when they understand what truly matters. In the end, Samson's strength had been extraordinary. But what made him truly remarkable was not the power in his arms. It was the courage he found in the end to surrender pride, to recognize his mistakes, and to act with clarity and purpose. And so, the temple lay in ruins, the Philistines defeated, and the land of Israel saw a brief moment of peace. The story of Samson became a story of reflection, a reminder that life's greatest battles are not always fought against enemies outside, but against the weakness, pride, and mistakes within. The man who had once thought himself untouchable learned, in the quiet of captivity and the final force of purpose, that true strength is always accompanied by wisdom, humility, and faith. Samson's life was a testament that even the greatest falls can lead to the greatest acts, and even the most flawed among us can fulfill their calling when they embrace it fully. His tale echoed long after the dust settled. Parents told their children about the boy born to impossible hope, about the man who misused his gifts, and about the hero who finally understood the true measure of strength. And in every telling the same lesson rang clear: it is not enough to be strong. One must also be wise, humble, and faithful. Samson's legacy lived on not just in the stories of what he did, but in the example of how a man could rise from failure, realign his purpose, and make his final stand a lasting triumph.